Imagine stepping back in time, not to a grand castle or a bustling city, but to a small village in the year 1255. What would life be like for a woman? What would her greatest hopes be, and what would her deepest fears be? And why, in a world so different from our own, was the thought of remaining unmarried, of becoming a spinster, such a terrifying prospect for women? Number 1. Dependence and vulnerability in old age. Picture a woman in 1255, her youthful vigor beginning to wane, her hands perhaps gnarled from years of work, her eyes dimmed by age. What fate awaited her if she had never married, if she had no husband, no sons, no daughters-in-law to care for her? In a society utterly devoid of social safety nets as we understand them today, old age without a familial support system was not just a challenge, it was a terrifying precipice of vulnerability. There were no pensions, no retirement homes, no government assistance programs. A woman's survival, from her very food to her shelter, depended almost entirely on the family unit. If she had married, her sons, by custom and often by law, were expected to provide for their aging parents. Daughter, even if married, might offer some comfort, but her primary duties would lie with her own husband and children. But an unmarried woman, she stood alone. Consider the harsh realities of agricultural life in the 13th century. The land was the source of all sustenance, and working it required immense physical strength and endurance. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, tending to livestock, these were not tasks for the frail or infirm. A woman past childbearing years, or simply past her physical prime, would find it increasingly difficult to earn her keep through manual labor. If she owned no land herself, and very few women, particularly unmarried ones, did her options dwindled to nothingness. She might try to find work as a servant, but even then, who would hire an elderly woman when younger, stronger hands were available and more desirable? Historical accounts, pieced together from fragments of medieval village records and court documents, suggest that destitution was a very real outcome for those who lacked familial connections. These records sometimes detail instances of individuals, often women, reduced to begging or relying on the scant and often unreliable charity of the local church or wealthier neighbors. Such charity was rarely enough for long-term survival and offered no dignity. Furthermore, protection from the elements, from illness, and from potential harm was almost exclusively derived from being part of a household. A solitary elderly woman, without the shelter and warmth of a family home, was exposed to the biting cold of winter, the ravages of disease that spread swiftly and mercilessly, and the dangers that lurked in a less ordered world. Without a son to tend a fire, a daughter-in-law to prepare a meal, or even a young child to fetch water, the simplest tasks of daily living could become insurmountable burdens. She might become a burden on her distant relatives, if she had any, but their willingness to take on such a responsibility was not guaranteed and often came with resentment and a diminished status for the dependent woman. The threat of illness was particularly dire. Medieval medicine was rudimentary at best, and nursing care almost entirely fell to women within the family. An old woman living alone, struck down by a fever or a debilitating cough, would have nobody to fetch her water, prepare simple remedies, or offer comfort. Her decline could be swift and lonely. Scholarly examinations of medieval society reveal a strong emphasis on lineage and the continuity of the family name, but also on the practical necessity of a multi-generational household for survival. Every member, ideally, contributed to the collective well-being. An old woman who had never married, and therefore never produced children to carry on the family name or provide for her in her twilight years, was seen not only as an anomaly, but also as a potential drain on scarce community resources if she could no longer support herself. Her very existence in her later years could become a stark example of what not to become, a cautionary tale whispered to young girls. Fear was not just of being alone, but of being utterly abandoned to the mercies of a world that had little compassion for those who could not contribute or who had failed, in its eyes, to fulfill their primary purpose of marriage and procreation. It was a fear of a slow, undignified fade into oblivion, marked by hunger, cold, and the crushing weight of utter solitude in a society built on interdependence. To be old and unmarried was to be, quite literally, left out in the cold. Number 2, inability to have children and continue the line. Consider for a moment the profound importance of children in the year 1255. It wasn't just about having a cute little one to cuddle. It was about the very survival of your family, your name, and even your immortal soul in the eyes of many. For a woman, the inability to bear children, and therefore to continue a lineage, was not merely a personal disappointment. It was a devastating social and spiritual failure that hung over the head of any unmarried woman like a perpetual storm cloud. Marriage was seen as the primary, indeed almost the sole, legitimate avenue for procreation. An unmarried woman, by definition, would not have children, and this absence carried monumental consequences. In a world where infant mortality was shockingly high and life expectancy was low, having many children was a practical necessity. Children were hands for the farm, security for old age, and the only way to pass down land, skills, and the family name. Without sons, a man's land might revert to the lord upon his death, or be fragmented among distant male relatives. Without daughters, there was no one to make favorable marriage alliances that could strengthen the family's social standing or economic power. For a woman, being a part of this continuation, of seeing her offspring grow and thrive, was her fundamental contribution to the household and to society. To be a spinster meant to be a woman who would never fulfill this most basic and expected role. She would never experience the joys, and indeed the sorrows, of motherhood, but more importantly, she would never contribute to the living chain of generations that stretched back into time and was expected to stretch forward into the future. Pressure to produce children was not just societal, it was deeply ingrained in the religious beliefs of the era. The Church, the dominant moral authority in 1255, taught that procreation was one of the primary purposes of marriage, a divine command from God. To abstain from marriage, and thus from childbearing, was seen by some as going against God's will, or at least as not fulfilling one's full human potential as ordained by a higher power. While nuns dedicated their lives to God in a different way, their celibacy was consecrated, set apart, and served a specific spiritual purpose. An ordinary woman who simply remained unmarried, without a religious vocation, was seen as choosing a path that denied this sacred duty. Medieval sermons and religious texts often emphasized the blessing of children and the importance of marriage as the vessel for this blessing. To be childless as an unmarried woman was to miss out on this divine blessing and to remain outside the accepted and hallowed order of things. Furthermore, a woman's identity was intrinsically tied to her marital status and her role within a family. She was wife of or daughter of, and eventually, mother of. Her social standing, her purpose, and her very sense of self were derived from these relationships. An unmarried woman, especially one who would never be a mother, was a person without a clear place in this structured world. She was like a tree that bore no fruit, a well that provided no water. She stood as a stark reminder of a biological and social dead end. Village gossip, a powerful force in close-knit communities, would undoubtedly focus on her childless state, perhaps pitying her, perhaps judging her, but always marking her as different, as somehow incomplete. Think of the emotional weight this carried. Every wedding she attended, every newborn she saw, every time she witnessed the bustling energy of a large family would serve as a poignant reminder of what she lacked, of the fundamental purpose she had not fulfilled. The knowledge that her family name, through her, would effectively die out, or that she would contribute no new members to the community, was a profound and constant source of anxiety. It was a fear rooted in the very fabric of medieval life, a fear of being barren, of being unproductive, and ultimately of being forgotten, an isolated leaf on a branch that led nowhere. Fear of spinsterhood, then, was deeply intertwined with the fear of a life devoid of the ultimate biological and social legacy, children. Number 3, spiritual concerns and sin. Imagine for a moment a world where the church was not just a building you visited on Sundays, but the omnipresent authority dictating nearly every aspect of life, from your daily morals to your ultimate destiny in the afterlife. 1255, the teachings of the Catholic Church held immense sway, and for women, spinsterhood was often viewed through a lens of significant spiritual concern, even bordering on sin, rather than merely a social inconvenience. This fear was deeply rooted in the Church's doctrines on marriage, celibacy, and the purpose of human existence. Primary teaching was that marriage was a sacrament, ordained by God Himself. It was one of the 7 holy sacraments, a sacred union blessed by the divine, and its primary purposes were procreation and the avoidance of carnal sin. For most people, marriage was the only legitimate and holy path to sexual expression and the raising of a Christian family. To remain unmarried, especially without a specific religious vocation, such as becoming a nun, raised questions about a woman's commitment to God's plan and her ability to live a virtuous life. While celibacy was praised for those who truly committed to a religious order, an ordinary woman who chose to remain single outside of the cloister was often viewed with suspicion. She was seen as someone who might be avoiding the duties of Christian womanhood, or worse, as someone who might be more susceptible to temptation and illicit behaviors because she lacked the sanctioned outlet of marriage. Church sermons frequently emphasized the dangers of unmarried life, particularly for women. Without the guidance and protection of a husband, it was believed a woman was more vulnerable to sin. Temptations of the flesh, idleness, and even witchcraft were sometimes associated with women who lived outside the conventional marital structure. While these were extreme views, the underlying message was clear: marriage was the righteous path for most. A woman who remained a spinster was seen as deviating from this path, potentially putting her soul at risk. Records from ecclesiastical courts, though rare for common people in this era, sometimes reveal cases where women's unmarried status was scrutinized, especially if they were perceived to be living an unchaste life or were accused of other transgressions. The fear was not just of worldly judgment, but of eternal damnation. Furthermore, a woman's purpose, in the eyes of the church, was deeply intertwined with her role as a wife and mother. She was to be a helpmate to her husband and a pious mother raising Christian children. By choosing or being forced into spinsterhood, a woman would effectively be sidestepping these divinely appointed roles. This wasn't just about societal expectations, it was about fulfilling one's purpose in the divine order of the universe. To not marry unless one joined a convent meant not contributing to the propagation of Christian souls, which was seen as a crucial service to God and humanity. Confessional, a regular and important part of medieval life, would also play a role in this sphere. A woman confessing her sins to a priest might be questioned about her marital status, her intentions, and her adherence to Christian principles. A life lived outside the traditional marital structure could become a point of concern for her confessor, who might urge her towards marriage as a means of achieving spiritual stability and avoiding temptation. The weight of this spiritual guidance, coming from a figure of immense authority, would have been considerable. Ultimately, the fear of spinsterhood carried with it the very real anxiety of spiritual damnation, or at least a diminished spiritual standing. To be an unmarried woman without the explicit sanctification of a religious vow was to exist in a liminal space, always under the shadow of potential sin and the watchful, often judgmental, eye of a church that dictated not only how one lived, but how one might find salvation. It was a fear that transcended earthly concerns, reaching into the deepest anxieties about one's immortal soul and eternal fate. Pressure to conform to this divinely ordained path was immense, and the consequences of deviation, in the minds of many, were truly terrifying. Number 4, loss of identity and purpose. Imagine living in a world where your very identity was almost entirely defined by your relationships to men, your father, your husband, and eventually, your sons. This was the stark reality for women in 1255. In such a society, rooted in patriarchal structures and rigid social norms, spinsterhood represented not just a lack of marital status, but a profound loss of identity, purpose, and even a clear place within the community. For a woman, remaining unmarried meant being perpetually in a state of limbo, always daughter of, but never truly wife of, or mother of, which were the recognized and respected female roles. A woman's name itself was often tied to her male relatives. Before marriage, she was identified by her father's name. Upon marriage, she would often be known by her husband's name or, at the very least, by her status as his wife. Her social standing, her legal rights, her economic opportunities, and even her daily tasks were all intrinsically linked to her husband's position and her role within his household. She became the mistress of his home, the manager of his domestic affairs, and the mother of his children. These were not just chores, they were a woman's primary spheres of influence and sources of respect. Without a husband, a woman had no clear head of household, no one to manage her affairs, and no specific role to fulfill within the established societal framework. She was, in essence, a perpetual outlier. Consider the daily lives of women. Married women had a clear purpose: managing the household, raising children, preparing food, making clothing, and often assisting with farm work. These were vital contributions to the family's survival and economic well-being. Even women from noble families had defined roles within the estate, managing servants, overseeing provisions, and upholding the family's reputation. But what about the spinster? Her purpose was ambiguous. She might live with her family, but she would likely be seen as an extra mouth to feed, a burden rather than an essential contributor. While she might assist with household tasks, these were not her household tasks in the same way they were for a married woman. She lacked the authority and responsibility that came with being the mistress of her own home. This lack of a defined role extended beyond the domestic sphere. In a community where people were largely identified by their family units, an unmarried woman might find herself socially marginalized. She would not participate in community events or social rituals in the same way as married women. Her advice on child rearing or household management might be considered less valuable because she lacked direct experience in those primary female roles. She might become a subject of gossip or pity, her status as an old maid, a whispered label that stripped her of individual recognition and replaced it with a social deficiency. She was not just unmarried, she was defined by her unmarried state, which in 1255 was seen as an undesirable lack. Even in legal and economic terms, her identity was diminished. While single women had more legal rights than married women, who were largely subsumed under their husband's legal identity, these rights often came with practical disadvantages. Without a man to represent her interests in the patriarchal legal system, or to provide economic stability, her legal autonomy often translated into greater vulnerability. She was not a Mrs. with an established position. She was merely daughter of, or the single woman, a status that carried little inherent prestige or security. Fear, therefore, was not just about practical survival, but about a deeper existential dread, the fear of being nobody, of having no clear purpose in a world that demanded everyone fit into a precise and established mold. It was a fear of anonymity, of being unfulfilled, and of never truly belonging in the way that married women did. Her loss of identity was a loss of self, a profound void in a world where personal worth was so strongly tied to relational role. Number 5, exclusion from community and family life. Imagine living in a village where everyone's life is deeply intertwined, where social connections are the very threads that hold society together, and where family is the core unit of existence. Now imagine being an outsider, a person who doesn't quite fit into the neatly defined roles that everyone else occupies. For women in 1255, spinsterhood carried with it the terrifying prospect of exclusion, not just from a husband and children, but from the very heart of community and family life, leaving them on the periphery, looking in. Medieval society was fundamentally communal and familial. Individual survival and prosperity depended heavily on mutual aid, kinship networks, and participation in the collective life of the village. Most social events, religious observances, and even daily work revolved around family units. Festivals, harvest celebrations, church gatherings, and even simple neighborly visits were often structured around married couples and their children. A married woman was part of a household, contributing to its social standing and participating in its shared responsibilities and joys. She had a network of kin through her husband's family, and her children often connected her to other families in the village. Her social circle was naturally robust, built into the very structure of her life. An unmarried woman, however, often found herself in a different position. If she remained with her birth family, she might be seen as an additional burden, lacking the clear purpose of a wife and mother. While she might help with household tasks, she wouldn't have the same authority or agency as the mistress of the house, who was typically her mother or a sister-in-law. She might not be consulted on important family decisions in the same way, and her presence might even cause subtle friction or resentment, especially if resources were scarce. She was always a guest in someone else's home, never truly establishing her own. Beyond the immediate family, the exclusion extended to wider community life. Village life was rich with social interactions, but these interactions were largely centered around families and couples. Women would gather for communal tasks like washing clothes in the stream, spinning yarn, or tending to gardens. But these gatherings were often opportunities for wives and mothers to share advice, gossip, and camaraderie related to their shared experiences of marriage and child rearing. An unmarried woman might feel, or be made to feel, that she didn't quite belong in these conversations. She might be pitied, or worse, subtly ostracized for her unique and unconventional status. Medieval social structures did not readily accommodate women who lived independently outside of a marital or conventual setting. Consider the simple act of attending church. While everyone went to church, the social dynamics within the congregation would largely revolve around families seated together, sharing communal prayers and rituals. An unmarried woman might sit alone, a visible symbol of her solitary status. Even during celebrations or feast days, where families brought their collective bounty and rejoiced together, her lack of a direct family unit might make her feel isolated. The community would often be a source of judgment as well as support. Gossip, a powerful tool of social control in close-knit medieval villages, would undoubtedly focus on unmarried women, scrutinizing their behavior, their choices, and their lack of a partner. This constant societal pressure, often subtle but pervasive, could lead to feelings of intense loneliness and alienation. Fear of spinsterhood, then, was also a fear of social marginalization. It was the fear of being left out of the most fundamental aspects of human connection and belonging. It was the fear of being perpetually on the outside looking in, of never truly being a part of the bustling, intertwined life of the community. In a world where collective survival was paramount, being cut off from the vital networks of family and community was not just emotionally distressing. It was a profound and terrifying threat to one's very existence and sense of worth. To be a spinster was to face a life lived largely in the shadows of others' complete lives. Number 6, lack of protection and security. Imagine a world where law enforcement as we know it barely exists, where personal safety is largely dependent on the strength of your family, and where disputes are often settled by local custom or sheer force. This was the reality of 1255, a time when life was often brutal and unpredictable. For a woman remaining unmarried, a spinster, meant facing this harsh world without the crucial shield of a male protector, leaving her profoundly vulnerable to physical harm, economic exploitation, and social injustice. This lack of protection was a profound and constant source of fear. In medieval society, a husband was legally and socially responsible for his wife's safety and well-being. He was her protector, her advocate in legal matters, and the primary defender of her honor and property. If a woman was assaulted, robbed, or defrauded, it was her husband who would typically pursue justice, negotiate with other men, or even resort to physical confrontation if necessary. For an unmarried woman, this critical layer of protection was absent. She was effectively on her own. While her father or brothers might offer some protection as long as she resided in their household, this protection was often conditional and lessened as she aged, or if her male relatives had their own families to prioritize. If she lived alone, her vulnerability was magnified tenfold. Consider the sheer physical dangers of the time. Travel, even short distances, was perilous, with threats ranging from wild animals to bandits. Living in a small village, while offering some familiarity, did not guarantee safety. Disputes over land, property, or even reputation could escalate quickly. For a woman without a husband to stand by her side, she was an easier target. Possessions, her meager earnings, and her very person were at greater risk. Historical accounts, often found in fragmented court rolls or manorial records, occasionally hint at the difficulties faced by single women, who might be more susceptible to petty crimes, harassment, or having their rights overlooked because they lacked a powerful male voice to champion their cause. Beyond physical safety, there was the profound lack of economic security. While a husband offered no guarantee of wealth, he was the primary earner for most families, responsible for cultivating land, engaging in trades, or providing for the household. A woman, particularly one not of the noble class, had limited avenues for earning a livelihood on her own. She might spin wool, brew ale, or work as a servant, but these were often low-paying and precarious occupations. Without a husband, she lacked the stability of a shared income, a shared plot of land, or the collective labor of a family unit. This economic precarity made her intensely vulnerable to poverty, especially in times of poor harvest, illness, or economic downturn. If she became too old or infirm to work, her situation became even more dire. Furthermore, legal rights for women, though existing, were often difficult to enforce without male representation. A married woman's legal identity was largely subsumed under her husband's. He would act on her behalf. While an unmarried woman retained more direct legal rights, navigating the male-dominated legal system, negotiating contracts, or defending herself in court without a male relative's support was an immense challenge. She might be easily exploited by unscrupulous neighbors, landlords, or merchants, knowing that she had no powerful male figure to turn to for redress. The very concept of justice for a woman was often filtered through the lens of male authority. Fear of spinsterhood, then, was intertwined with the stark reality of personal vulnerability. It was the fear of being unprotected in a dangerous world, of lacking the physical and economic shield that a husband provided. It was a fear of being exposed to the elements, to violence, to exploitation, and to injustice, without the security and advocacy that marriage, however imperfectly, offered. To be an unmarried woman in 1255 was to live with a constant, gnawing anxiety about one's safety and survival in a world that offered little mercy to those who stood alone. Number 7. Economic ruin and poverty. Imagine a world where money, as we understand it, was often scarce, where most people lived off the land, and where the family was the primary economic unit. 1255, economic survival was a daily struggle for many, and for a woman, the prospect of remaining unmarried, of becoming a spinster, was inextricably linked to the terrifying specter of economic ruin and crushing poverty. This wasn't just about living modestly, it was about the very real threat of starvation, homelessness, and a life of destitution. The fundamental economic structure of medieval society was agrarian. Land was the source of wealth, food, and sustenance. While women played an indispensable role in farming, from sowing to harvesting, and in household management, direct ownership of land was primarily vested in men. A woman typically gained access to land and its produce through her relationship with a male head of household, her father, and then, crucially, her husband. When a woman married, she became part of her husband's household, sharing in its resources and labor, and benefiting from the security his land or trade provided. Her labor, combined with his, ensured the family's survival. An unmarried woman, especially one without significant inheritance or a prestigious family name, faced immense challenges in supporting herself. Her options for earning a living were severely limited and often poorly paid. She might work as a domestic servant in a wealthier household, but this often meant long hours, low wages, and precarious employment. She might engage in women's work like spinning wool, brewing ale, or baking bread for sale, but these were often supplemental incomes, not enough to sustain an independent household. The skills she possessed, while valuable within a family, were rarely enough to guarantee economic independence in the wider, male-dominated economy. Think of the sheer difficulty of purchasing food, paying taxes or rents, and maintaining a roof over one's head, all without a steady, substantial income. Furthermore, social custom and legal norms often disadvantaged unmarried women. While single women had more legal rights over their own property and earnings than married women, whose property was largely controlled by their husbands, in practice, these rights were difficult to exercise without a male advocate or the economic leverage a husband provided. Access to credit, resources, or even fair prices for goods or labor was often harder for an unattached woman. She might be more easily cheated or exploited, knowing that she had no male relative to defend her interests. Medieval court records, though sparse, occasionally illustrate disputes over property or debts, where single women struggled to assert their claims against men with more social standing or economic power. Dowry system, prevalent in many parts of Europe, also played a critical role. Dowry was a sum of money, goods, or land that a bride brought to her marriage. It was intended to support her and her children, and in some cases, provided a safety net if she became a widow. However, assembling a dowry could be a tremendous burden on a woman's family. If the family could not provide a suitable dowry, their daughter's marriage prospects might dwindle, condemning her to spinsterhood and consequently to economic hardship. Her very lack of a dowry could become a self-fulfilling prophecy of poverty. In a society where survival was often measured by one's ability to cultivate land or secure a trade, an unmarried woman faced the constant threat of starvation. If she could not work due to illness, old age, or simply lack of opportunity, she would quickly fall into destitution. There were no public welfare systems, no food banks, no unemployment benefits. Charity from the church or wealthier individuals was sporadic and insufficient to support a large population of impoverished single women. The terrifying image of an old, impoverished woman begging for scraps without a home or family was a very real possibility and a constant source of fear. Fear of spinsterhood, therefore, was fundamentally a fear of being left utterly adrift in a world where economic security was a lifeline, and without marriage, that lifeline was often cut. It was a fear of living a life defined by gnawing hunger and pervasive insecurity. Number 8, social stigma and shame. Imagine living in a society where your worth as a woman was almost entirely tied to your marital status and your ability to produce children. This was the stark reality of 1255, a time when social roles were rigidly defined, and deviating from the norm carried immense weight. For women, the prospect of remaining unmarried, of becoming a spinster, was fraught with deep social stigma and profound shame, creating a terrifying burden that could overshadow a woman's entire life. It wasn't just a personal choice, it was a societal judgment. In medieval Europe, marriage was not merely a personal union, it was a cornerstone of social order, a sacrament, and the expected path for nearly every woman. From a very young age, girls were raised with the understanding that their ultimate destiny was to become a wife and mother. Their education, informal as it might be, often revolved around the skills needed to manage a household and raise children. Songs, stories, and the examples of every woman around them reinforced this singular ideal. To not marry, therefore, was to fail to fulfill this fundamental expectation, to deviate from the universally accepted path for women. This deviation often led to immediate social labeling. Unmarried woman past a certain age, often considered to be in her mid-20s, would begin to be whispered about, labeled as an old maid, or by terms that, even then, carried connotations of being undesirable or incomplete. The term spinster itself, while originally denoting a woman who spun wool, a common occupation for unmarried women to earn a meager living, became synonymous with an unmarried woman who was past her marriageable age, acquiring a negative and often pitying overtone. It was a visible mark of social failure. Consider the role of community gossip and public opinion. Close-knit medieval villages, where everyone knew everyone else's business, an unmarried woman would be a constant subject of speculation. Why hadn't she married? Was something wrong with her? Was she too plain, too poor, too ill-tempered? Perhaps even worse, was she too independent, too strong-willed, qualities that were often viewed with suspicion in a patriarchal society. These whispers, though seemingly intangible, could crush a woman's spirit and isolate her from her peers. She might find herself excluded from social gatherings of married women, subtly marginalized from conversations about marriage, children, and household management, which formed the core of female social interaction. This stigma wasn't just external, it could be internalized, leading to deep personal shame. A woman might feel she had failed her family, her parents, and even herself. Parents who would have invested time and resources in raising her would feel the social dishonor of having an unmarried daughter. They might worry about her future, and her presence in their home could be seen as an ongoing burden, both economically and socially. The weight of this disappointment, real or perceived, would be a heavy load to bear. She might be constantly reminded, by subtle cues and overt remarks, that she had not achieved the expected status of womanhood. Moreover, the inability to marry could sometimes be interpreted as a sign of some hidden flaw or even divine displeasure. While the Church praised celibacy within a religious vocation, for an ordinary woman, spinsterhood might invite questions about her piety or virtue. Was she denying God's will? Was she harboring some secret sin that made her undesirable in the eyes of others? These spiritual anxieties compounded the social shame. Fear of social stigma and shame was a powerful motivator because it threatened a woman's very place in her community and her sense of self-worth. It was the fear of being constantly judged, pitied, or even ridiculed. It was the fear of being seen as an anomaly, an outsider, a person who had somehow failed to play her assigned role in the grand societal drama of medieval life. In a world where collective identity and adherence to tradition were paramount, the shame of spinsterhood was a terrifying and pervasive reality.